Well, welcome everyone. How wonderful really to see you here. This is the first time we have an in-person event this semester, and I am so delighted. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to be here and to see you in the same room. And I also want to welcome our audience who is joining us via webinar. I'm Anita Berrizbeitia, Professor and Chair of Landscape Architecture. And I want to begin by acknowledging that the Harvard Graduate School of Design is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. The school also recognizes the work that the Harvard University Native American program has done in cultivating the relationship that led to the creation of this acknowledgement. Before we get to today's event, a quick reminder that we have live captioning available for our virtual audience. To enable captions, click the closed captioning button at the bottom of the live stream window. I also want to invite you to join us for an upcoming GSD public program that will take place this Friday, April 8th at 4:30 p.m. for a closing reception to celebrate the GSD's current exhibition, Interrogative Design Selective Works of Krzysztof Włodyszko, which will be on view through April 8th, and there is more information available at the GSD's website. So it has been 2 years since the start of what has been arguably the most intense reckoning with the social, environmental, and economic legacies of the world as we knew it. And for us, one piece of this reckoning has been a refocus of our public lectures on inviting a range of historians, landscape architects, writers, public intellectuals, voices that bring a different outlook and expand our ways of knowing our field, its complicities, and its potentials. Our guests tonight bring such new perspective, and I am very pleased to welcome Jenny Jones and David Godshall of TERREMOTO. Their firm, which is based in Los Angeles and San Francisco, was established almost a decade ago in 2013 by David and his partner Alan Pourroy, who built an agenda for their practice that questions basic assumptions we have long taken for granted. With a provocative and at times polemical tone, they declare that, quote, they create well-built, site-specific landscapes that respond to client needs while simultaneously challenging historical and contemporary landscape construction methods, materials, and formal conventions. They describe their design approach as, quote, post-internet, critically regionalist, and politely inflammatory, end of quote. Indeed, they are resisting what they describe as a still prevalent corporate model of 1980s and 90s practice where bigger means better, where scaling up is a condition for staying afloat financially, and where, quote, the more expensive, more complex the design detail and construction is, the better the project, end quote. Instead, they focus their work on smaller, humbler projects produced in what appears to be great numbers. Over a period of 6 years, they designed 150 gardens, many of them in historically working-class neighborhoods in East Los Angeles. The dynamism and evolution of their practice emerges from a deep self-reflexivity towards the history of landscape architecture, oscillating between reverence and criticality for what has come before. In what ways can we say TERREMOTO is emerging as a critical practice? I'll mention a few. First, they avoid as much as possible demolition. They are carbon light, in favor of negotiated interventions between existing and new, in a process that aims to produce an expanded aesthetic imagination. Horticulture plays an important role in this process as a hinge between past and future, as LA's multicultural and diverse communities find expression in the richness of their horticultural practices. Second, they silence the performative, or the constant need to justify landscape through what it does, what it saves, what it costs in terms of money, and the services it provides. Related to this is questioning the standard representation of built work at the moment of its completion, as if frozen in time. Instead, they show it while it is being constructed. And more recently, they have foregrounded issues of fair wages and working conditions for immigrant workers in their own context of the West Coast. The studio's response has been to write and represent their work more accurately as co-design, communicating the role of labor and local vernacular knowledge in the production of their landscapes. Theirs is an explicitly political practice. Ultimately, they tell us that the means matter as much as the ends, giving us a glimpse into what a more just society could be. Process, in their practice, is more than ecology. It is expanded to encompass the social relations through which the work is done. Please join me in welcoming David and Jenny of TERREMOTO to deliver Radical Gardens of Love and Interconnectedness. That was great, Anita. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. The light is on us. I guess to start, thank you. That was the kindest, most well-written thing I've, yeah.
Hard to follow.
Yeah. So we're honored. And without getting too new agey about it, we're just thankful to be with everyone here in IRL and also via the interwebs as well. So we're thankful of that and cognizant of that. So I'm David Godshall.
I'm Jenny Jones.
And we run the TERREMOTO Los Angeles office. My business partner, Ellen Perroy, and Story Wiggins run the San Francisco office, and we'll kind of talk about office structure in a minute. But Jenny and I are natural project managers, so we are project managing the lecture here as well. And so this kind of is a rundown of everything that we're going to cover. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay. This is basically what's going to follow. Land acknowledgement, we are a team. Origin story, early years, recent themes, test plot, land and labor, and radical gardens of love and interconnectedness. And we'll go fast. There's a lot of slides. You're probably seeing that there's 135 slides and thinking that's crazy, but we charge. So we're just going to go. And then we're excited to also open this up and speak with everybody here as well at the end. Green button, right? Yeah. Following on kind of what Anita said, it's increasingly important for our practice, both in kind of talks like this as well as design presentations, to acknowledge the fact that the projects that we do in California, both southern and northern, are on land that was previously tended to by other peoples. So with that, I'm not going to read the whole thing and do that thing where I'm reading a thing on the screen, but TERREMOTO recognizes and acknowledges the Tongva, Kizh, Fernandeño, Tatavian, Chumash, Ahachiman, Serrano, Pomo, Wapo, and Coast Miwok and Ohlone peoples as the original inhabitants and stewards of the lands on which we now live and work in California. We're going to start by kind of just being very, doubling down on the fact that we are team. This is our happy office photo, of course. This is slightly misleading. Our office isn't quite this big. We're about 15 in Los Angeles and 8 in San Francisco. But a few partners and children snuck into this photo. But Jenny and I want to be very explicit about the fact that though we stand here before you, it is a collective effort at every single level, and so to say otherwise would almost be misleading. This is a kind of a specific slide that we wanted to put in because a thing has happened, I would argue, historically in the profession of landscape architecture, wherein the reputation and or legacy of an office has become decoupled from the way the office actually works. We'd like to challenge that convention and actually reattach office structure into like kind of explicit conversation in the way we portray our practice. So with that, we pay hourly. And that's the thing that we kind of did from the beginning. It's important to us that people are paid for every hour they work. And what it does is that also requires in turn that we are better business managers about how we allocate time and why, so that if a person needs to work overtime, they are compensated accordingly. With that, we generally only work 40 hours a week. Full benefits, killer bonuses. We have a very soft hierarchy. I say that clearly as a guy standing behind a microphone, so I acknowledge that. But when I say soft hierarchy, I mean that everybody has a seat at the table, and either Jenny or I are a little bit involved in every project, but what we do is we give everyone on the team, whether like senior or more like junior, like a ton of autonomy. It's been a thing that I've noticed historically that the lack of autonomy is what kind of makes people kind of like leave and move on. And
Depressed,
so,
yeah.
And so by actually requiring that everyone on the team design their own project and have a lot of skin in the game, what it's done is it's allowed us, kind of to your point, Anita, about building a lot of gardens. It's also kind of like, in a passive, subtle way, made us also really really productive, and so that works well in that regard. And I'll just burn through this now. Yearly retreat, we sponsor like volunteer time, a community action fund, and a profit sharing program is in the works. And I'm saying this at this lecture, so now the team can hold me accountable to making sure that that's enacted within 2 to 3 months. And I say this not like in a braggadocious way, but we feel like our profession has kind of like set the bar somewhat low with like labor practices, and I think this is something that's rumbling and we're all very aware of it. But we say this because we want to be explicit about how we structure our office, but I would also argue that because we have structured our office in a way that doesn't follow historical models, it has also in turn allowed us to create a body of work that also doesn't follow historical models.
I'm just going to interrupt for a second. This is also constantly evolving and changing. So we're not trying to be dogmatic about it, about this is the perfect model. Like some of these things we've only recently implemented. So we're still learning and adapting as we go, kind of daily.
We just got dental insurance, for example. It's a weird thing to say. We are a team. This is our office retreat from last year. And again, everyone has a seat at the table. Heart to hearts, we try to have conversations that, what is it that we are doing and why, and constantly self-interrogating that. Towards the end of the lecture, that's gonna like dovetail back into Radical Gardens. But like supporting each other, like a weird like hack to like making like a successful office is that because we are a small office, everyone has to do everything, so we don't really have space for ego and like hierarchy. We try and structure projects so that like it's not like everything has to go through me or Jenny or Ellen or Story. Everyone's working on their own projects, and so other than checking in intermittently, that allows us to like just be prolific kind of by default. And so yeah, we talk, and because everyone has each other's backs, it doesn't take a lot of that, like to just like for that to like reverberate and just like be like really productive and wonderful and kind. This is a boring slide, but did I do the laser? There.
Laser, yeah.
Yeah, so this is what we're talking about here, is that we just wanted to mention this to everyone. There was a certain point, it was actually during the time that there was a lot of civil unrest in our country after the murder of George Floyd, and we were having like these conversations as an office as to like, how do we do better? And one of the many things that we kind of like landed on was that we wanted to start giving back to our communities, and one way of doing that is with money. There's other ways of doing that as well, and we do those other things, but one way of doing it is with money. And so a thing that we do you can see there it's called the Social Justice Surcharge. It's since been renamed as the Community Action Fund. We had a cool, interesting client who is a action organizer or something, and she was like, you shouldn't call it the Social Justice Surcharge. That no one's excited about that. She's like, you should give it a name that makes me like excited. So it's a thing we do where when we write a proposal, this is just a letter of agreement to start a project. I just blocked out the pertinent information, where we simply ask of a new client to make a donation to our Community Action Fund. TERREMOTO then matches that, and then we basically amass this pocket of money that then at intervals we collectively as a team decide what to do with this money, and we give it to people doing good work in our communities. And Rebecca Greenwald, who's sitting right there, is basically responsible for that. Sorry to point at you. It's a wonderful thing that we do together, and it's kind of like helps us like do like sense making, but also I would offer that it sets a really good tone. Like before we've even started our design landscape architecture project, in a small way, we've also made the world slightly like better in a small way.
Before you go to the next slide, I'm going to improv a little bit and also mention that we have just also instituted an addendum to our standard contracts now that's essentially a client syllabus, because we struggled with, there's a lot of like ethos that we want to inject into our projects, and how do we make sure that our clients are on the same page with us when these questions come up about how much you pay your gardener and about how much of a carbon footprint your project is going to be. So we've decided now to give a little cheat sheet to our clients at the beginning of a project, so they get this and they get a little syllabus of like the values that are important to us.
We're trying to navigate like how like we still, if a person just wants a cool garden, that like we're like, yeah, we want to do your garden, but also don't like overwhelm them with information. Yeah. So it's like a thing that we're ongoingly figuring out. And yeah, another picture of the team staring at stuff. I'm going to do a super quick origin story. Alan and I started the office about 9-ish years ago. We started the office doing very small, modest residential work. When you start a small practice, public work doesn't come your way. That's like not a thing that happens. We had also like historically worked on projects that were residential, and we always liked them. The feedback loop is like really quick. You can go from concept to completion like in a very short matter of time, and it allowed us to learn, make a million mistakes, and just like kind of create a body of work that was like explicitly ours. A lot of these projects, this project is like in Eichler in Orange County, and honestly not far from where I grew up. Pardon me. And this is a before, not an after. I should be clear. We didn't propose a dead lawn. But a lot of the projects we did in the early days were small, and it just allowed us to build a body of work that was ours. In addition to that, we're also of the mindset that the residential project aggregates. We are kind of backing our way into public work in kind of a weird, obtuse sort of a way, which we'll get into at the back of, at the end of this lecture. But to us, it always seemed like kind of powerful that, like in theory now, like in our pocket of Los Angeles, at least where Jenny and I and our office works, we've done over like 250 gardens. So if you were to like think about that in like a what's the term, patchwork ecology sort of a mindset, that then we're actually like really like immediately radically impacting our neighborhood and the ecology of our neighborhood in a really strong way. Now we're gonna kind of just like dart through, Jenny and I kind of like mapped it out, and we decided that rather than speaking to you guys about like a single project in our approach, we're just gonna kind of blast through like subtexts and through lines like in all of our projects that kind of like permeate our body of work. The first being simple details. We believe, and our office believes, that oftentimes like the best design solution is perhaps one of the more simpler versions of itself. We kind of eschew design solutions that are complicated and prone to breaking, and also we champion like the everyday. It was a funny thing in that sometimes historically, like in previous places that I worked, where there was a conflating of like the more expensive and complicated like a detail was, the better. And like in the early days, we kind of like made a decision that like we wanted to just like kind of reject that, and in lieu of that, kind of like embrace the beauty of like everyday kind of more simple, humble solutions.
Cost effective.
Yeah, and cost effective. And to be honest, like we're building gardens to this day and historically that have very small budgets. Yeah. So kind of like leaning into like, what can you get at the hardware store?
I think also when we were both working at other firms and coming through school, there was a theme of, I think the internet was sort of ruining landscape architecture or design in general. It was all very splashy and sexy, and all about a rendered image that you'd never seen anything like it before, and this is going to blow your mind. And what attracted me to TERREMOTO initially was the very overt rejection of that and the embracing of simple materials.
And we should give Alan due credit. Alan once said to me, like over a beer, we should let the material define the detail, not vice versa. So rather than like coming up with a detail and then trying to like force it into like its manifestation that like it doesn't want to be, this is kind of the antidote to that. And we think it's beautiful. We hope you do too. But yeah, simple details, local, in general, a through line is like local materials. And we'll kind of circle back to this at the end as well, but like increasingly we're of the mindset, like, can we build a landscape that in large part is composed of materials within 100 miles of the project site? That's kind of like a metric that we kind of like quietly like keep in line. This is local like Sonoma moss rock, essentially, that we use to kind of delineate like the edging in this parking lot on this project in Sausalito. And yeah, just letting things be what they are.
I've always loved how so many of our projects, they're just, under-designed. You don't need a bench that is elaborately designed. A rock can be a seat. A stump can be a seat. It's the original seat. So just returning back to that is really lovely.
This is a project where all that wood that you see, actually not the wood on the right that's painted, but all that wood that you see was harvested from a local mill and repurposed. And yeah, we laid it out on site. And this project, these paths kind of speak to the idea that, and we don't want to like bemoan like the presence of construction documents, but increasingly, pardon me, construction documents are a means to an end, and they're incredibly important. What I would also like kind of offer is that we try to build in as much latitude as possible, and a lot of this is like client education, but we try to get ahead of that and kind of make sure that we have the space to improvise and allow for serendipity in the build of a project. This was a project there was no way we could create construction documents for. I'll spare you like the long-winded like tirade about why that was the fact. It's not a tirade, but explanation. But this was a project that in large part like we figured out on site with the builders.
But that project was also recycled wood, right?
Yep.
Which is another big theme you see in a lot of our work. We like to collaborate with local wood reclaimers, and it's pretty popular both in Northern and Southern California. There's a company called Angel City Lumber that we work with a lot, and they reclaim dead and dying trees that are coming down all over Los Angeles, Southern California really, due to disease and drought. And there's some beautiful tree species there. And they reclaim it, they kiln dry it, they mill it, we use it. So we love that kind of aspect of recycling that also is a material that informs the design. And so we like to go to their yard and look at what's available and then design from there. And
working in that way kind of like passively ensures that your project is a manifestation of the community from which it is born. So that's cool. We think it's cool. So conceptual concepts with a Z. So early days, Alan and I were always of the mindset that we wanted to create gardens and landscapes that were conceptual investigations into things of all various types and sorts. Back in the early days when we were young and aspirational and naive, we kind of always were like, what's the concept? Like you start a project and it would be like, what's the concept? What's the concept? With time and experience, we realized that sometimes, like in this project, we actually formulated the concept prior to initiating the design process. Other times, that's not always the case. And so now we kind of give ourselves the breathing room to, sometimes you just have to start on a project, and you have to like start and drawing and get into it. And sometimes the concept for a project might hit you in the middle, and also increasingly we'll finish the project and then kind of look back at it and then be like, oh, that's what we did. And so these conceptual narratives kind of, we try to the best of our ability, let them like underpin our work, like at all times, though we try and give ourselves the space to be like fluid about what they are. The concepts range wildly from project to project, and that's a function of the fact that every site is unique, every client is unique, and every place in the world is a little bit different. So this is just a smorgasbord of imagery that kind of, I think, starts to illuminate like what it is and what we're after, and trying to stay true to ourselves with these conceptual underpinnings in our projects has allowed us to create, I would like to think, a body of work that is quite like different and diverse in that as an office we have a wide-ranging like number of things, of types of gardens that we find beautiful. We find French gardens beautiful, and vacant lots beautiful, and Japanese gardens beautiful, and so through working in this way, it's allowed us to keep things fresh.
And not being slave to a concept. So very rarely are we like, it's a Japanese garden and we're gonna make it look like that. It's more about mining those different styles for ways of working that I think is really interesting and manifests pretty clearly in our work.
Yeah, and actually, to be honest, increasingly trying to untether ourselves from toolkits of the past, like only drawing and plan, for example, and instead letting ourselves dream on like what a garden could be, and actually like realizing that in the design process in a different way. We recently wrapped up our the first phase of a project at the Sea Ranch Lodge, and so this was the first page in our presentation to the client, and we simply, rather than just jumping in and saying like, here's what we've come up with, to the best of our ability, when able and when inspiration strikes, we try to ground ourselves in like philosophy. And that's kind of what these get at here. I'm gonna kind of blow through them. 135 slides, you gotta go.
What are we on?
You gotta go.
37, okay.
Yeah, we're doing okay.
Let's go, yeah.
It's on our website.
Let's just look at our website.
Yeah, just look at our website. This is a terrible thing to say at a lecture.
You get the idea.
Yeah. You want to process?
Yeah, I'll talk about process. That was another thing that initially really gravitated me towards TERREMOTO. No, yeah.
Thank you.
That's you. I was at home on maternity leave, and I looked out I'm just going to tell this story. Sorry,
Sure.
David. I didn't plan this. I know, Karen.
It's true.
And I was just bouncing my baby, and I walked outside, and I saw David sticking his sign in the ground that said TERREMOTO landscape, and I said, well, there's not that many of us. I'm going to go Google him. And so I went back.
I was building a little community garden.
A little pro bono garden at the elementary school across the street. And I went inside and Googled, and I saw it wasn't even a website. It was like a Tumblr page. It was the early days of TERREMOTO, and it was like a light bulb. I just all these photos of process, and the fact that David and Alan were honoring that and celebrating that and giving it space and visibility was just so different to me. And I just wanted dirt under my nails. So that was one of the first things that, so I went out and introduced myself.
She tackled me.
I did. I was like, hire me.
And I do have to say, it was, when I started, I had like an interesting conversation like with my friend who's like a branding guy, and like my wife, and I was like, what should I do for a website? I don't want to do like the same website that every office has. And the conclusion of the conversation was, oh, you should just make a super confusing website that doesn't make any sense. So I would say like almost like naively, that's how this process stuff started. But then over the years, it's evolved, and almost in a weird way, there's been like a retroactive, like philosophical like realization where it's like, oh, we've always found process beautiful. It's almost like odd to me that other offices aren't as explicit with it, because gardens are processes both from their conception to their existence ongoingly. And so, yeah, to that end, it's served us well.
Yeah, so you'll see on our website, there's always a lot of process photos. We're not a design build firm, but we like to behave like one, which is really fun. We're just on site a lot. We collaborate closely with contractors. We repeat our work with contractors as much as possible. We like to get out there and place plants and dig holes and move rocks and get dirty with the guys. And we find beauty in the process. So I think it's also a little bit of a protest against the finished garden image that you see on so many firms' websites and magazines and just the media in general, to just show that gardens are not a finished product. It's, you know, we all know this, but it is amazing how much we perpetuate that idea in our imagery.
And this is a random anecdote. I was sent an article today. I promise this will be a weird tangent, but it was actually, so Steve Albini, who's the music producer, who's also very famous at this point, it was a letter that he wrote to like Nirvana, trying to convince them to let him record the album that would become Nevermind. And in the course of this letter, like where he's trying to convince them, he basically like states his process and how he does it and why. And it was this like fascinating letter. It's so beautiful. I imagine if you Google it, you can find it. But he basically states a couple things that I kind of almost feel like that are poignant in terms of like to landscape architecture practice. The first being that he said, if you can't record an album in a week, you probably shouldn't do it. And I think he was basically advocating for expediency. I'm not going to like bemoan like the perils of like the large, huge project, because large, huge projects are also important in a different way. But I liked that because the residential project, in a way, like quietly like has that that you can have an idea and then like see it through completion in a very brief amount of time, and then it exists, and then it's changed, and hopefully it's a positive thing onto the world. And then the other thing he said was that bands that don't allow for accidents, sorry, it's so weird, I'm quoting Steve Albini. Bands that don't allow for accidents and chaos in the recording of their album make boring albums. And to the best of our ability, we're not gonna like go so far as to advocate for chaos, because this is construction, but I thought that it was very an astute sort of a thing that in theory also applies to garden design, in that we make construction documents that get us to a certain place, and they're a means to an end. But then also we, again, I'm kind of belaboring this point, I apologize, but then we also try to make space for improvisation and serendipity and being on site and like dealing with the thing on site and wrestling with it.
Yeah, I mean, this image here, the
Weird
next...
tangent.
Oh, oh no, good tangent. This was basically drawing with a mower on site. So yes, we do construction drawings. Yes, we do plans. We do all the normal drawings that landscape architects do, but we do not treat them as sacred. We know there's a lot of inherent knowledge that the guys have on site that we don't. And so we look to them for guidance all the time. We'll even do things on drawing sometimes, and we'll just say 3 to 5 boulders, and we don't even locate them on the plan. We just know we're gonna use them when we get there, and we'll figure it out then and there. And I think there is a lot of beauty that comes out of that serendipity.
See, and Jenny shows up and bosses everybody around.
The men, I like to do that, yeah. We like boulders.
And so that's kind of, I'll blow through these process. Planting. Let's talk about planting. We'll keep going fast. It's 7:11.
We're doing good.
Okay. So we are a horticulture, botany, like heavy office. Almost everyone in the office is a gardener, like in some sort of a variety. It was a thing historically. I think it's getting better now, but I think historically there was a moment where landscape architecture, maybe landscape architecture, capital A, capital L, capital A, kind of drifted kind of erroneously too far from gardens. And our kind of like polite rebuttal to that is to build gardens that are horticulturally like ambitious and adventurous. It's been a journey. I would be disingenuous to you if I were to state that like where we started 9 years ago is where we are now. When we started 9 years ago, our interest in like native plants, for example, wasn't like such a thing. We've evolved. Increasingly, we're trying to build projects that are 60%, 70%, 80% to 100% native. The reasons for that, I'm probably preaching to the choir, so I don't kind of need to extol the virtues of like native planting to an audience of landscape designers and designers of different sorts. But essentially, when you use native plants in a garden, the garden becomes much bigger than you and your experience with it, and that suddenly, like, you're reconnecting your garden to, like, the local fauna that, like, existed prior to human settlement, and also they're just really beautiful.
We are not strict. We're not super strict about the natives. There are some people in the native plant community that are very strict, and we still like to mix things up and celebrate some of the vernacular horticulture that we see in, for example, East LA, where we live and work. Our gardens are very influenced by what we see driving around Los Angeles, the kind of global mashup of plants that exists in Los Angeles. You see that pops up a lot in our gardens. We'll come on site and we'll see like a bramble of agaves that is not native, but instead of ripping it out, we'll cut the pups and populate them around the site and just work with what's there as best as we can.
Culture and, like, civilization is inseparable from the manipulation of horticulture, right? So, of course, we need to do better by making gardens that connect to ecology in a more meaningful way, but we try not to be puritanical about it. Things aren't, it's complex.
Yeah. We are also big proponents of dense planting, and we've gotten criticized a little bit from some people in the past about not projects like this where it's sort of open and sparse, but in some of the other images you've seen, we plant very densely, and we think it's great. The plants sort of commingle, and they all seem to grow a lot faster, and they're happier. It's a theme that
Thomas Rayner, who we are very much huge fans of, kind of advocates for planting densely and doing planting communities.
And then there's a new restoration method that maybe has already spread on the East Coast, but it's hitting the West Coast, which is the Milwaukee Forest method. Are you all familiar with this, the microforest method? Everyone in LA is very excited about this right now. And nobody knows if it's going to actually work in LA's climate. But that advocates for planting very densely for the plants to kind of all support each other. And in general, we do in our gardens, which I think makes for a lot of beautiful chaos. Back to the word chaos.
Sure, keep any chaos. Cool. And test plot.
Test plot.
All you.
So test plot is an ongoing experiment in community land care. Test plot operates with a repair and care mindset. We're both agile and slow. Before we spend money and time on high-gloss park designs, we ought to take care of the public and open spaces that we already have, and that might be improved just with a little love.
And I guess we should say, now we're talking about a single specific project, rather than drifting.
We are.
We were drifting up until this
Although
point.
test plot has now grown and is now many projects, but a lot of these pictures are of the original test plot, which started in Elysian Park, which was near our old office, and also where both of us live. It came about because we would simply walk in the park, Elysian Park, which is LA's oldest public park, and it was in a pretty sad state. The ecology was in a pretty sad state. A lot of trees were dead and dying, not a lot of ground plane diversity to speak of. We started attending some community meetings and really quickly realized that the city had bigger, legitimate urban problems on their hand. Crime, homelessness, graffiti, infrastructure, lots of big, expensive problems.
I'd say Parks and Rec had neither the interest nor the means in, like, actually addressing the poor ecological condition of the park. It's a public, that's not a company. What's the word I'm looking for? Entity, thank you.
Yeah.
That's, like, simply, like, overburdened.
Yeah, so in attending these meetings, we started kind of in the background brainstorming about what could we do to kind of pierce this bureaucracy and help to change the ecology of the park. So we brainstormed with some members of the Citizens Committee to Save Elysian Park, as well as Max Cantor from Saturate LA, which is a maintenance company in Los Angeles that specializes in native plants. And at first we wondered, should we just do like a guerrilla garden? Should we just seed bomb and, see what comes up? Or should we get this sanctioned, or how do we do this? And ultimately we got it sanctioned. We had to kind of navigate the bureaucracy and pierce it in an agile way. The garden is supposed to be temporary. Don't tell anybody, it's not really.
It's not.
But actually what has happened is that test plot is a test of what are the minimal inputs that it takes to get like a robust native ecology reestablished in Elysian Park. But it's also a test of community capacity. So we started test plot right before the pandemic, and test plot became a big savior for a lot of people in that stressful time. People were locked inside. There wasn't a lot of outdoor activities that they could do. And volunteers showed up in droves to help tend these plots.
And I'm actually going to go back a little bit.
Go.
Basically, at Elysian Park in particular, to explain what's happening ecologically speaking, is that there is a ground plane that is basically monolithically invasive grasses that are rampant throughout Southern California. They are like a legacy of like European settlement, bringing agricultural mustard and cheatgrass and things that were useful for agriculture, but in an environment where they didn't have co-selective pressures. Essentially, these invasive species have just run rampant. So the green that you're seeing here is actually what we did is we preemptively watered to encourage the seed bank of invasive species that was sitting there dormant within our plot. And then before it actually went to seed, we then eliminated all the seed heads and weeded it. So we did a couple of rounds of this before we even got into it. And then you can kind of see, I have a laser pointer, wish me luck. That is Heteromeles arbustifolia, and that is like an old sycamore that somehow made it. Those are native species, but in large part, everything that you see beyond, it's like a zombie eucalyptus forest. So that's kind of like the state of the park. Because people had been tinkering with it forever, it was in a terrible way.
And a big fire hazard also. Yeah. That mustard and that cheatgrass are highly flammable, and they come and they knock it down every year, which is part of why we have the fencing up so that the rec and parks guys don't weed whack our natives. So we consulted with as many experts and community members as possible on what the best approach was. We did that water weed regimen that David talked about to flush out the invasive seed bank. And it was pretty successful. A lot of volunteers came out. We weren't perfect. We had a lot of failures. The gophers decimated 2 of the plots where we decided to plant a lot of grasses without any gopher cages. We basically created a salad bar for the gophers during the summer. We replanted with black sage and things that they don't eat as much, and they're doing a lot better now. Test plot was so successful that we started collaborating with the University of Southern California's Landscape Architecture Department. Jen Toy has led a couple studios there that has taken this initial proof of concept and expanded it to other parts of the city. So there's the original Elysian Park test plot, and there are now 4 other test plots all around the city: Rio de Los Angeles State Park, Baldwin Hills State Park, Debs Park in collaboration with the Audubon Center. There's one now at USC's campus. The energy is very palpable, and people are clamoring to get out and to steward their public lands. And what's exciting is that the governmental agencies there are very open to this idea. They're in fact desperate for the help. They don't have big budgets. They're excited to have us help out with the land stewardship.
It's a cool, weird, we didn't like start it necessarily with the idea that it would grow beyond us, and it is, but that's like almost the best metric of success in a way. But like community land stewardship of public land is kind of, it's this thing that now that we've done it, back to the concept, sometimes you want to do a thing, you have a good impulse, and then we start it, and now it's growing, and we're like, oh, this is what it is. And it's almost, it's like rhizomatically, like I feel like people want to figure out how to make the world in whatever capacity that they can better, and test plot's like a pretty like, do this thing.
Yeah, I do want to also mention that Jen Toy is going to formalize test plot and establish it as an official nonprofit. So get ready. And Harvard, if you want to do a test plot, we will collaborate with you.
Anita will be following.
Jen Toy was a co-founder of KDI, Kankui Design Initiative. So she has a lot of experience in community work, and she's the person we want because she is going to help. What's interesting about these plots is that they're all in very different communities, and so there's no single model of stewardship. We're not saying that there's one formula for how to steward your lands. The point is to meet the community where they're at. Every model of volunteer program is entirely different. It depends on whether we're working with millennials who are flaky or the elderly who are... I'm joking.
Sure. Okay.
half joking. Or the elderly who are super committed and show up every Tuesday at 9 a.m. no matter what. So we actually retired. We have different. The programs are structured differently depending on who's showing up and who's interested. The plants are different at every site, so test plot is not a one size fits all. I'm going to just read the guiding principles real quick.
Sure, go.
Cultivate beauty and biodiversity. To be low tech, low budget, hands in the soil, maintenance is not a dirty word. To honor and work with the seasons, to plant for climate change. Experimentation is good, permission to fail. Monitor and evaluate, open source. Expansion and scalability in mind. Seek a coalition of community groups and work somewhere between native gardening and ecological restoration. We found when we were exploring the idea of test plot, we didn't fit into like a previous model. The ecologists, the restoration ecologists sort of poo-pooed the idea. They're like, you're not really doing...
but they were skeptical.
They were skeptical. They were like, what you're doing is not really restoration. And we said, we know. And then the native gardeners said, well, what you're doing is not really native gardening. And so we lie somewhere in between, and we think that's kind of cool. Test plot's also a very explicit, actually, I'm going to let you say this slide, and then I'm going to tie it into the land and labor.
And now it's bigger than us. Random person who I follow on Instagram, slid into the DMs, we started talking. He lives in the Netherlands, and now he's doing a test plot. So it would be myopic of us to try and retain coherent authorship of it, because the goal of the thing is ecological in orientation. So it is our greatest hope that it just floats away in the world, and then it becomes this thing that's viral, and it can grow and live on its own in a million different ways.
And in fact, if you're in Southern California, for anybody who's watching online, if you go to the test plot website, testplot.info, we actually have a PDF manual called How to Make a Test Plot that is the students at USC made, and it gives you the instructions on how to do one if you're in California.
So we look forward to returning, and there's a test plot
here on campus. Test plot is also a very, you can go, you can, okay. Yeah. It's a very explicit celebration of labor. So as I said, maintenance is not a dirty word is one of our key principles. I think in the last couple decades in landscape architecture also, those of us who have been in offices have seen from clients, low maintenance, no maintenance. Maintenance is bad. It's an expensive thing. And test plot is a little bit of a protest against that and trying to bring young people out and show them that labor is a good thing. It feels good. It's free. It's better than therapy. And
we should go fast.
Okay. So this ties into our land and labor topic, which I'll explain. You saw in our earlier slides about process. So we celebrate process a lot. We're on site. We collaborate closely with the builders and with the gardeners. And that had been kind of fomenting at TERREMOTO for a couple years. But then we formalized it into a working group within our office with big help from Rebecca Greenwald, who essentially said, all these ideas that you're talking about lifting up the gardener and getting contractors paid more and giving them more visibility, these are important things that people should be talking about that they're not. And so she helped us formalize these ideas and put them out into the world.
Metropolis?
Yeah, go, yeah.
Whoops.
So we put this article out, was it last year, Rebecca? Landscape architecture has a labor acknowledgement problem, and there was a pretty positive response to this. This was not a manifesto. This was not us saying how things we should be. This was us just pointing out and calling out that we did not see enough representation of labor in the field of landscape architecture. And this was also a way to kind of hold ourselves accountable. By writing this piece, it means that we have to follow up and stick true to this topic.
And the historical precedent of the monograph is problematic in that regard, and that we've all been conditioned to these books come out and they're like these lovely, and believe me, I love these books. We have an office full of them, but that the conventional monograph is really shows projects in a finished, perfect state, in which they are very rarely. And so, yeah, this is us kind of putting up our hand in the air and being like, actually, this isn't how landscapes work.
Well, and you've said before, the erasure of labor from those finished photos is pretty rude, right? None of these gardens or landscapes would exist without the care that goes into them, the construction and the care that goes into them. So to bring those hands and that work to the surface, we think is very important. Something else we've seen, actually, I'll come back to that. So we now have an internal working group called our Land and Labor Group. We have a couple things we're working on, including harassing the media to write more about this. We have some internal initiatives, including like interviewing gardeners and contractors about pay and their contracts, and getting nosy with them about their contracts and making sure that they have profit, overhead and profit included, adequate overhead and profit. And we have, even Rebecca has brought to our minds the issue of language injustice. So we now have formalized Spanish lessons in our office so that we can communicate. You know, we're big on collaborating with the builders on site, and not all of them speak English. Not all of them speak Spanish either, but a lot of them do in Southern California. And so making it so that we can communicate better with the people on site. Another big part of this is the devaluation of land care. So a big problem that we would have is we would build these gardens and then they would not be properly cared for. We'd come back after a year or two and see that they just weren't receiving the care that they needed. And what we concluded was that, at least in Southern California, the problem is gardeners are paid so little that in order to make a living wage, they have to go to 15 gardens a day. And what that means is that they're spending 45 minutes at each garden, blowing, mowing, and going. And I wouldn't really even call it care. It's janitorial. And it's not enough. And it is doing a disservice. So when we undervalue the labor that's going into our landscapes, we're devaluing the land itself, which I feel like in the face of climate change is the worst thing we could do. So we are spending as much time as possible talking to our clients about paying everybody more. And the fact that if they have some climate guilt, well, let's pay your gardener a little bit more and take care of the land better.
And then lastly, Radical Gardens of Love and Interconnectedness is our ridiculously bombastically titled name for kind of a trajectory within our office that kind of piecemeals a lot of the things that we've been talking about together. In that, if you think about gardens, gardens are, the term garden I think refers to a human-designed space that is a manifestation of horticulture, materials, and labor. So at TERREMOTO, we're currently in this moment where we're deeply self-interrogating how we could go about making gardens that are omni-positive in their relationship to all of those things. I think that the kinds of problems that we face and that the world is facing today are the kinds of problems that I would say like existing processes and like toolkits that we have inherited from the past like don't actually work for. We can't create gardens like that are better or gardens for the next civilization if we're using tools from the past. So what this is it's an ongoing and iterative manifesto that changes constantly, that we kind of use in the office and everybody is contributing. It's essentially a Google Doc, let's be honest. But basically, we are self-interrogating how we have practiced in the 8 years behind us constantly and trying to identify where we are doing harm on the earth, whether that harm be carbon, essentially through pouring much more concrete than we need to, and or using tropical hardwoods, which is something that I have done historically and which we no longer do. So it's essentially a Google Doc that we're constantly changing as a team that allows us to basically up our metrics in terms of how we can go about making gardens that are just, fair, and generous in their relationship to ecology, material, and labor. So yeah, a lot of, like, honestly, a lot of things have changed. Even like the screenshots that you are seeing here are almost like slightly obsolete in that the principles, we realized there was a certain point that the principles had a subtext of righteousness, and that wasn't what this is about. This is just about constant self-interrogation. So we've actually recently turned the principles into questions. So it's a series of questions through which we could sit down with a client and ask them these questions and then figure out, depending on their answers, how we could make a garden that is the most positive and good version of itself.
Not all of our gardens are radical. This is like, we are striving for this.
North Star.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the North Star, and it's a funny thing in that what's happened recently is that our philosophy and these principles have evolved faster than the body of work in our office can even keep up with. So, for example, like moving forward, we're trying to like build, not build new ground-up swimming pools for single-family homes, but we have 10 of those in the office right now. So we're basically not writing new proposals for these sorts of for the projects that don't necessarily comply by our metrics of like good gardens. So it's a hell of a thing. We're figuring it out, and in the fact that it is iterative and constantly changing, it gives us the latitude to explore and be wrong.
You should talk about one of the tenets being the marriage of the old and new.
Sure. This is a good image in that, so the very first principle is that old and new are married. When you don't erase the previous manifestation of the garden in service of the new, that immediately will make a garden much more carbon light, and also you marry history in a way that's really beautiful. This is a garden that we did in Mount Washington that had crumbling, let me go back, crumbling like zoo rock, and it was structurally falling apart. The client had neither the interest, we were blessed with a very special couple clients in this project, but had neither the interest nor like the budget for redoing. If you were to engage with a structural engineer to like redo a crumbling hillside like this in Mount Washington, $500,000 is gone just in the structural reinforcement. So we needed to figure out how to do something that actually leaned into what was there before. And in this version, we actually left the crumbling like outcropping of rock, and our new garden essentially floated on top of the old. And so there's also, within the principles, there's certain things where we are pro-gardener, as Jenny kind of just mentioned with our land and labor initiative, but we are against, in a soft way, wholly outsourcing your gardening duties. So part of like, if a garden is going to be radical, the homeowner actually in some part needs to meaningfully contribute to the ongoing care of the garden. This is kind of like a long way of saying that like, I would say like this, one of the major sources of like societal malfeasance is like being completely disconnected with the land on which we live. So if you're taking care of the land on which you live, then you have some skin in the game, and then you're reconnecting with nature. And it's a cool project, I like to think. But it's made, the gardens that we've done thus far that kind of abide by these principles are quite radical. And for example, I think that stacked stone concrete block that you see there would be anathema to most like high landscape architecture design offices, but leaning into like simple, dumb materials and then like using them in really elegant ways like also permeates through this effort as well.
Cheap. We like cheap stuff.
Cheap and good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's this project. And then this is another one that we did in Echo Park.
In Southern California, we have the big problem of irrigation. Watering is like the #1 limiting factor for a garden, and the amount of plastic that we see in the landscapes in Southern California just drives us bonkers. We can't even fathom how anybody who call themselves landscape would be okay with that. So radical gardens, we try to have no irrigation systems. It's all hand watered.
Yeah, like basically we're trying to identify our blind spots. And there was like a moment where we're like, why are we designing gardens that need irrigation systems? Because an irrigation system speaks to the fact that ongoingly this garden will be consumptive. I say this like having built all of our gardens have irrigation systems, so I'm like complicit in this.
Yeah.
But like as an office, like when you say that as a subtext, then immediately like a few things happen. Well, if we want to make a garden that doesn't have an irrigation system, that means that it needs to have, the plants will need to have evolved to be on this kind of land, which immediately orients us towards mostly native gardens. But then additionally, what that does is it pairs the homeowner and or the gardener will need to hand water through establishment, and then the homeowner is reconnecting emotionally with their land. And so like it's kind of like this weird hack where actually it's like, okay, if we're not going to do an irrigation system, then the garden is native, and then people are taking care of it and interacting with it. And I would offer that that is a superior version of a garden to one where that is not happening. And we're going to stop. We have a few
wanna
more
stop?
slides, but I'd rather open this up to everybody. Is that cool? We do not.
No.
Sorry. If you had asked us before, I would have done it. Sorry.
We'll send them to you.
Yeah. Next time you're in LA, we'll go. Hello. Are we crazy?
How you guys doing?
Hi, my name is Skylar. Thank you so much for the very enlightening and refreshing way of speaking about landscape. I just have a question, or maybe something to start the conversation. When you spoke of maintenance as a way of developing a relationship with the land, you mentioned nature and coming into like a relationship with nature. Could you explain more what you mean by nature as it in the context of these gardens?
Deep. The first one is deep.
Thanks a lot, Skylar. I don't know. We're not separate from nature. Nature's not this thing that we're separate from. We are a part of it. But, even as landscape architects and gardeners, people who we think we're pretty connected, I feel like I still have so much more connecting to do to get integrated. So the people who are not gardeners and landscapes, gardeners and landscapers, which is most of the people in our society, are very divorced from it, and they're not actually divorced. And so, I don't know. That's a little rambly. David, take it from there.
It's going to be rambly too. Tough question.
Yeah.
I would say I don't think I consider the gardens that we make. I wouldn't describe them as nature. I think there's a dichotomy between a garden, which is kind of like what I was saying earlier about being a human-designed manifestation of botany, materials, and labor, and actually history and the land. But I would say that through planting mostly native plants, for example, we are reorienting land that previously had a functioning ecosystem on it, that had at some point, historically speaking, been erased. And then we are, to the best of our ability, repairing its ability to re-engage with a greater regional ecosystem through doing using plants that are endemic to the region. So it kind of answers your question.
I'll add one more thing. I think the stewardship component is key. It's not so much about defining nature. It's about an act of being with nature and a relationship of reciprocity that is lacking. So it's not about, even as we espouse native plants, I'm finally getting around to reading Rambunctious Garden, and now I'm like, oh, have I been leaning too hard into native plants? Should I be more open-minded about what an ecosystem can be? And I think what we're coming to is the most important thing is a meaningful relationship.
There's a garden designer who is in the Midwest. His name is Benjamin Vogt, and he's like a super intense advocate for native plants. And he actually uses this term, which I find kind of loaded but poignant. He calls it human supremacist. So historically speaking, we've been designing gardens to be human supremacist in that they prioritize the experience of the human in the garden. And we're hopeful and optimistic that ongoingly we can make gardens that prioritize ecology. But then at a dumb level, also as a guy who has a garden that's mostly native, it's also just awesome. In that the number of birds and lizards and everything that's going on, it's a very different sort of a thing. So I think we kind of answered your question. For weird
We can keep
ways.
the conversation going.
Hi. I'm not sure how this is going to go as I get it out, because I think it'll be a little bit of the rambling form. But first I want to start out, I'm a huge fan of your firm's work. You spoke in our Core 3 last semester, and since then I've been following your website, and it's just everything about your ethos and what you spoke about today just really resonates. And the question I have is sort of about how you approach materiality, multi-sensory engagement with the site, and the process of representation and drawings. Because one of the things that I've been finding that I think perhaps is influenced by a background in textiles and fashion is everything is that I'm used to designing is so grounded in material. So here I'm struggling in an era of landscape architecture that is so much living in the model space of a computer without influence from materiality, or just everything that is alive and live matter of a site. So I was really like your drawings that you showed that were hand sketched and all of the process work. It felt like more how I would imagine designing a site that is sort of a conversation back and forth. So I'm curious how you go about that, of like, where do you start? What in general are you doing with the drawings in terms of getting to what looks like the finished drawing type thing? And does that even matter in the process?
I'll start. David likes to encourage everybody in the office to go plant shopping. So at the start of a project, obviously the first thing is we look around the site, and Los Angeles is blessed with a very diverse horticulture. So it's very interesting to just look at the skyline and see palm, cedar, sycamore. What? It's just a cacophony, and a beautiful cacophony. But so there's inspiration there, but then we like to just go to a nursery and see then what comes from there. So that's a very like tactile way that we can engage with the material of our practice, and we do that often.
And you should take this anecdotally, because I would also say that TERREMOTO is an outlier in this regards, in that most offices probably do more buttoned up construction documents than we do, and that's okay. That's their way of working. What we found, like within our office, is that, kind of to our earlier point, like the drawing needs to get you to a certain point, and then your presence on site, talking to the client, talking to the crew, is actually like much more meaningful than having a super dialed construction document. Though I would also acknowledge that that varies from project to project. Sometimes on more corporate and or civic projects, which those kind of necessitate a drawing set that's like super crisp and dialed. But I would also say, like, the worst place to design a planting plan is from behind a computer. And so technology is inescapable. So it's almost like, how can I use the machine to get as far as I can in this regard, and then get away from the machine and open myself up back to like serendipity again. But like going to a nursery and like assembling a planting plan in real life is like, it's not something that should be done behind a computer. So increasingly we're trying to like interrogate as an office, like what are we doing that's dumb? Oftentimes the things that we were doing that was dumb, we were doing simply because that's how it was taught to us. So I think trying to figure out like where the wisdom is in like historical modes of like representation and landscape architecture, and also like the things that are like trying to understand what was good that we've learned and what is also like no longer useful like for our practice or in this changing world in which we live, if that makes sense.
Don't get us wrong too, we have, there's a diversity of approaches within our office too. So there are some people in the office that are more digitally minded and they do renderings and they use, I don't even know what the name of the renderer is.
Blu-ray.
No, that's not it. You don't even know either. Some SketchUp plugin.
It's Podium.
Podium, yes. I'm a Luddite. I hand draw. I can't do it. And if a client asks me for a rendering, I say no. And I do a hand sketch instead. Or if I absolutely have to because the client's fussy, I get help. But there are other people in our office that are more digitally minded and they make amazing renderings that blow your mind and they like working that way. So there's a freedom and an adaptability that we try to allow everybody in the office.
And we're not like rabidly anti-technology, but we question, it's a means to an end. And I also like, I'm always skeptical when I like see either a building or a thing and I can tell the program it was designed in, you know what I mean? Like
that's a
we should be more
project.
Yeah, we should be more free than that. So yeah. But also don't listen to anything we just said if you want a job at a normal office. Sorry.
Noted, noted. Thank you both for sharing your work. I thought what was kind of interesting about this presentation is we talked kind of 80% about values in the kind of manifesto behind this work, and maybe 20% about the design. And I think we can do that because the values are so inherent and so obvious in these designs in this presentation. So I think that's pretty cool. What I am wondering is, because you're so vocal and so kind of clear about your values in your statement, do you oftentimes find yourself in a position of turning down jobs that maybe aren't for your firm, or clients that you may not agree with and might not see eye to eye? Do you oftentimes find yourself kind of turning down those projects, or do you take on those projects with the responsibility to do them as best you can?
Me? It's a good question. We now turn down a lot of work. That historically wasn't the case. Young business had to stay alive, had to pay ourselves, had to make payroll. Having a reputation or being like a buzzy firm is like a relatively recent thing. And we're thankful for that. But now it's an interesting thing in that we do have to turn down projects. It's easy to turn down projects that don't align with our principles, or we can tell that they're bad, or they're developer driven, or whatever it is, and we can just say no to those and not look back. It's very painful. We recently made a decision to proactively keep the office about at the size that it is. There's a lot of reasons for that I won't, it's like a longer thing. But if Terremoto wants to continue to be Terremoto, then we can't scale beyond a certain size, because then we will become beholden to larger projects that will not allow us to express all of the woo-woo stuff that we just explained to you. So now increasingly we do have to turn down work for wonderful people, and we take no joy in that. But now what we do is we try to send them towards other garden designers who have more bandwidth than us, but also we're thinking about making a book that's basically along the lines of how you can make a Terremoto garden, and then actually giving it to the world so that people write a book that puts our business out of business, right? Write a toolkit, and so kind of give a toolkit to the world that's here's how you can make a garden, because it feels unkind and or selfish to not help people, to not build as many regionally ecologically robust gardens as we can in the places that we live, because that's kind of the mission. So these are things that we're struggling with. While also, again, back to the point, we have these principles and stuff, but again, explicitly, not all the projects in our office abide by these principles at present. And so payroll is a real thing, not to be that guy, but it is. So it's all about balance. But while it's taken Terremoto to get from point A to here, and it's possible that it'll take another 8 years to get to wholly exclusively working on projects that kind of abide by our ethical metrics.
But when you're first starting out, you don't have that luxury, and so you take what you get. And I like to sneak in things where I can. So I've snuck in Quercus agrifolia on clients' projects, the native coast live oak in California, on clients' projects where they didn't ask for an oak, but I put a baby 5-gallon in just in the back, and it's not for the client, it's for the birds 100 years from now. And they don't know about it. So there's little acts of subversion that you can do. So even if you have a client where you might not agree with the whole thing, you can sneak in little acts of subversion. So I encourage you to do that.
Hold on.
Okay, is it on now? Yes. I just wanted to follow up a little bit, because while it's true that the talk focused on values, there is no opposition to design. I mean, there were some high-value design decisions. The work is very visual. There are details there that are, that don't come out of nowhere.
Sure.
You all have backgrounds in those design firms, right? But so there is a value to, let's say a certain kind of beauty that you're saying, why can't we use that word? There are real decisions there that don't just happen. In fact, I don't think you could actually make a manual about your garden that would come out like your garden. There is a certain kind of authorship there. It comes out. So why, and I'm here being devil's advocate.
Please.
Also because, it's not just leaving it to the birds and the bees, their willfulness. There is welcomed, refreshing willfulness in some aspects of your work that I think need to be also celebrated and discussed, right? And
Thank you.
some that
I
you
think-
did, and some that you didn't bring here, such as the.
I wonder
chamber
if Alan
restoration,
was here.
But there is a kind of craft. I mean, even in that boardwalk that you showed, that is not easy to do. That is not just your regular sort of National Park Service boardwalk by any means. That is a a designer, capital D, boardwalk.
I would agree with most of everything you're saying, and I guess what I would say is, to play devil's advocate against your devil's advocate, we're big believers in craft. And if you're going to build a thing, you should do it really well. I think that boardwalk project, it would be interesting to me, now I'm just going to ramble, but if that project came to our office now, if we would go about it in the same way. Because though I'm very proud of it, I'm also increasingly skeptical of hyper-legible impositions of geometry on land. And I think that was a project of which we're very proud, and we believe in craft and all those things, but increasingly our gardens are more ecological in orientation, and those gardens lend themselves slightly less legibly to loud geometries. All that being said, I'm kind of not answering your question, I acknowledge that. Is that it's also possible that you can have a garden that's ecological, in its subtext, that through which a highly designed boardwalk goes, and that those two things can kind of coexist beautifully. Yeah. So and maybe that's actually the trick, Anita.
That is the point. I mean, there is a kind of harmony even in your super densely planted whatever gardens, that is perceptible. I mean, at a kind of a very human level. I mean, those things are, perhaps we can't sort of name them, but you feel the harmony, inherent in nature that is there. That I think you're actually you know how to get there.
Sure.
With it, because the colors are harmonious with one another. I have not ever seen a slide where actually you mix up your
orange
your hues in the wrong way, etc. So right, it comes out of knowledge of materials with plants.
We don't
they behave. What they do.
We don't want to undersell the value that we place in beauty. We do think beauty is an important trait to be honored. I mean, it makes for an attractive photo, and it makes for people to be excited about gardens that look like that, which I think is a good thing, because the more gardens that look like that people can have, So beauty. I think you're right to point it out, and I also wonder if Alan and Diego were here,
sure,
you would have gotten a different lecture. So you're getting the David and Jenny lecture today, which is a little more
hippy dippy woo woo.
Yeah, there's others in our office that are more exacting and precise and love details. And if Sam Webb was up here, it would be different. Yeah.
But I also, to your point, I think, thank you for your compliments of our planting, for example, but I think it can be all those beautiful things, and also for the birds, and also for the person, and I think it's about coexisting.
Exactly. But the problem is that, sort of the way contemporary discourse is going is that it's
One or
it
the
is
other.
seen, or exactly, it is actually very kind of polarizing, binary thinking that, in fact, what I liked about your work is that it's not that.
Thank you.
We need your help writing our book.
And I think the book could get people like 60% of the way there. But anyways, we haven't written it yet. We don't know.
Hi. Thank you so much. I'm curious with your firm's interest in planting. Do you have conversations with the planting industry? Like, you talked about propagation, and I was just wondering, do you have any influence on what gets grown where you're working? And I'm just would be interested to hear your thoughts on, or if that has been a conversation with you in your projects.
David has just
The answer is kinda, sorta.
Yeah.
I would like to be so self-important to think that like through our office, like more white sage is getting planted across like California. Like that would be like a net gain. And we have like actually a long game for our office is we actually want to start propagating our own plants. This is kind of like answering your question, but also not at this point. But that's the thing that we want to do. So kind of, sort of. I wish that our connection to growers was a little bit more meaningful. We recently had an incredible garden designer who works in London come to the office, and it was a revelatory conversation because her relationship with the growers in the United Kingdom, they almost work in concert with landscape designers work in concert with the growers, and it's a little bit like more dry, like in our instance, but yeah, that was not like a fun answer.
We are interested in starting a propagation kind of outfit because there are sometimes plants that we simply can't get. No one's growing it, and we have somebody in our office that used to work at a plant nursery. We have connections. We know people and we talk, and we're always talking to these people. But I can't say that we, have influence.
And I'd like to say it's like one of these things, we were talking about this today because you know how like you go to the supermarket and there's like 4 types of apples, but there's actually like hundreds and hundreds of species of apples that have just been like marginalized through like the dull monotony of like the agriculture machine. Like that analogy also works with like plants, in that there's all these plants that just for whatever rhyme or reason aren't popularized in like nursery, like the wholesale nursery industry. So in some regard, we have worked with growers to be like, can you start growing this plant? And then they'll start growing it, and then we'll start using it. The same thing happens with the construction industry. Like left to its own like machinations, like these industries will kind of like end up propagating like the dumbest versions of the things. So we're constantly trying to like jostle those things, but which gets into we'd like to start growing our own plants in the end. So
But then we make a plant popular, and then it becomes popular, and then we can't find it anymore.
Yeah,
Acacia
we ruined
covineae.
Acacia itaeophylla for ourselves.
Yeah.
Because we started using it as a hedge, and then a lot of people started using it as a hedge, and now it's not available anywhere. So anyways, all fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Hi again. Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
We're coming up on time, but I just want to show some love to a couple people who sent in questions from the online audience.
Cool.
And I'm going to kind of combine two that go back to some of the earlier conversation, an earlier point in this conversation. So an anonymous person says, how do you reconcile the ethics of largely ornamental gardens in a context of water and other resource drought? And then I want to piggyback on that with a question from Kevin Talma, who says, inspirational, I can relate from working in the Caribbean with limited budgets. How do you make the business side work? And I'm bringing these questions together because I feel like you were getting at this a little bit when you were talking about still choosing projects that maybe aren't 100% aligned with what the principles are because you have to make payroll, et cetera. So if you can kind of get back into that a little bit.
I would push back and say that our gardens aren't primarily ornamental, would be my first pushback. back to our notion of beauty existing simultaneously with ecology, I think that's possible. So I would like to like respectfully say like, though perhaps our gardens are like decorative in that they're lovely, that they're also operating at a level, they're operating at an environmental level. And then what was the second question?
How do we make payroll?
How do you make payroll? Well, so this is an interesting distinction in that we sometimes work for very, very wealthy people. We also work for people and organizations that have no money. So we balance our body of work in the office like through these things. And I would say like one measure of profit is money. Another measure of profit would like almost be love. And I think that's like a thing that's not necessarily talked about that often, that we fight aggressively to make space in our body of work and projects in the office to do projects for working class families and or nonprofit institutions and things like that. We'll also work on a rich person's house. That's real, but also payroll is real. Increasingly, we're trying to blur the distinction between those two things through whether you're working on the wealthy person's house or the working class and or nonprofit's house, that regardless of the client, that we're doing right by the site and we're building gardens that abide by like our principles in large part. So that's kind of like holistically how we like balance the fact that it's a house in Beverly Hills, but we're planting like a mostly native garden. And then we're basically doing the same approach for like a family in Godshall Park or whatever it may be. Is that?
Yeah, I think we also, because we like to behave sort of more on the design build end of the spectrum, we seek out clients who are okay with improvisation on site. So we do light construction sets. So we're different from other firms. Instead of spending a lot of time on DD and CDs and laboring on these exacting construction sets, we're lighter on that end of the labor piece, and we're more heavy on the on-site CA, which I think leads to a more fruitful result, and that you can see in the garden.
We love the small project with the small budget if the client is cool and we can do it fast. That's kind of like how we roll.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for
Thank you.
Thank you.